So you woke up this morning and chose violence in your D&D campaign. Well, do I have a solution for you? After watching the Critical Role Vox Machina versus the Mighty Nine Battle Royale, I felt inspired to think of other ways to add PvP combat into D&D that's both fair and fun. And then once I started thinking about that, my head started spiraling into other roguelike, arena, and battle royale scenarios that could work well in your D&D campaign. It's also a lot of fun to think about ways to optimize and min-max a character, but you don't want to detract from people's role-playing experience in other games. So this way, you can have a one-shot or mini-campaign idea where you can fully explore your min-max ideas. So here in this video, I'm going to give you 3 different Battle Royale, Roguelike, PvP one-shots that you can try in your home D&D campaign. Dungeons & Dragons is notorious for being a bit unbalanced when it comes to power levels of different classes. And while it may not seem obvious when you're working together as a party, it definitely starts to stand out when you go toe-to-toe against your fellow player. In the standard PvE scenario, these differences don't usually come to light because whenever there's something you're lacking, there's usually another player there to pick up any slack that you think you have. These are just suggestions of what I think would be really fun to do as a D&D one-shot or mini-campaign, or even add it into your own campaign. Of course, you can always tweak and change what I have to make it more fitting to your party or your playstyle. And if PvP competition is not something that you want in your campaign, that's okay, because all these scenarios can work really well in a PvE scenario. And with that said, let's start with number 1. Roguelike or Slay the Spire type mini campaign and one shot. This was the first idea that popped into my mind when I first saw the Critical Role Battle Royale. I love the video games Slay the Spire and Hades for their branching path system and progression over time. However, I also added some PvP to see if that would spice it up a little bit. I ended up actually trying out this idea at home for a one shot that I did for my birthday. We had 2 dungeon masters and 2 teams of 3. I suggest not doing anything higher than that, as the combat ends up taking way too long, especially for a one-shot idea. To start, the players did not know who would be on their team, and were not allowed to talk about the different characters that they were creating in order to ensure that we can make it as balanced as possible. They all started at level 9, that way all spellcasters had interesting but not too overpowered spells, and melee characters can also have a few tricks up their sleeves. Everyone could start with as many mundane items as they can carry in encumbrance, and in the end, after all the characters were made, the DMs decided who would be on each team in order to make it as balanced as possible. During the one-shot, each team had a choice to go through one of 3 archways. The DM would describe what was outside of each archway to give an idea of what the type of scenario they would be encountering. Each of the encounters can be either combat, puzzle, or both, depending on how you want to run it. Once the encounter was completed, the players were all rewarded a currency amount. It could be gold or anything else you would like, and that was used in the store that was in between each level. The items in the store and the currency itself was in a limited supply, so the players had to decide carefully what item they wanted to purchase that would help their entire team. And after a certain amount of floors, the characters would level up and progress and learn spells, and this would continue for as many floors as you would like until the final room, which would be a PvP encounter against the 2 teams. We also added certain elements to make the 2 teams feel like they were still interacting with each other even though their encounters were in 2 separate rooms. One random player from each team was asked if they wanted to either aid or harm the opposing team. If both teams chose to aid, then each encounter would be much easier than what was originally planned by lowering hit points or removing the amount of monsters, etc. If one team chose to aid and the other team chose to harm, the harmed team would have a much harder encounter with padded HP, layer actions, legendary resistances, and so on. However, at the end of the encounter, they would have an increased amount of currency, whereas the team that was aided would get the easier encounter, however would get less currency. And if both teams chose to harm the other team, then both would encounter a slightly harder encounter, but nothing as extreme as one aiding and one harming. The players did not know what exactly would happen when they chose if they would aid or harm, which added an extra level of complexity and excitement and interaction between the 2 teams. The item store in between levels was also shared by both teams, so there would be a limited supply of items that would have to be carefully chosen before the other team chose it. In the end, I think this concept worked really well for our group. Having 2 DMs and 2 groups to manage was a bit chaotic in one house, so I feel like in order to improve this for next time, you could have 2 mini campaigns going simultaneously, where in between each floor you would tell the other team what you chose, as well as the item store maybe not being shared. And that way there could be interesting story beats in between each floor where maybe the characters all have one large session where they get to talk, interact, and even roleplay if you'd like. The second idea that I came up with was the Colosseum/Horde survival competition. This was a concept I thought of that would bring a competitive edge to D&D without having direct PvP. As we know, PvP can be a bit unbalanced, so this way we can make sure that all the players have a fair chance to engage and compete without being directly conflicting with each other. In this competition, 2 teams would be placed in a Colosseum or arena and battle the same hordes of enemies in waves until the last team is standing. Running this scenario can be done in 2 different ways. You could either do the 2 DMs, 2 teams route, where each DM will be running each wave separately for each team, as we did in the previous scenario. However, in that situation, you'd probably run into the same problem that I had with the first example, where it would get very chaotic in your house if you ever did that. Plus, finding that many players for either scenario is probably very difficult, especially nowadays. Or the alternative is you can have 1 DM with 2 teams of, say, 2, and they can all run under the same initiative and the monsters in the same initiative, but have 2 separate arenas for them to compete in. And of course, since this is Dungeons and Dragons, you don't even have to use the same exact arena for each wave. You can have them magically teleported into a different realm or dimension or location that can have interactable terrain that could help give them an edge in combat. If you want to have some sort of progression, you can have it where after each wave or certain monsters drop different magical items. It can be something pre-made, or if you really want to get chaotic, you can roll from a magical item table. However, if you want to keep the purity of the competition and just see who lasts longest with the characters that they've created, you can leave all that stuff out and have them battle. And the final scenario that I came up with is the Maze Escape Room competition. First one out wins. If you want to have a non-combat based competition between 2 teams of players, or even individuals, the Maze Escape Room scenario works really well in this situation. 2 teams can be pitted against each other to see who can make it out of the room or solve the puzzle first. Keeping combat out of these types of scenarios helps keep fairness in the timed aspect of this. As we know, players take all different amounts of times going through a combat round, and you don't want to make it unfair for the other team. And the only way to truly keep this fair, I believe, is to have, again, 2 different DMs running 2 different teams, so that way each team is not talking over each other to get the attention of the DM. As players progress through the maze or room, they can encounter many different types of puzzles and traps. Think Indiana Jones, and see who gets out first. Or, if you only have 1 team of adventurers, you can have it be a time scenario where they have to get out before the timer runs out. There are tons of resources online where you can find interesting and engaging puzzles for Dungeons and Dragons. There are random dungeon generators, or you can pull known dungeons from different campaigns and tweak them for what you need. For example, there are many dungeons you can get from the Yawning Portal module and the Dungeon of the Mad Mage module. And if you really want to go all in and have some sort of interaction between the 2 teams, you can have them each be able to set traps or re-trigger traps in rooms to have the other players interact with. But the most important thing to remember about creating puzzles in D&D is that you want to make sure that no matter your team composition, they can solve the puzzle. If you have a team of 5 fighters, you want to make sure that there's at least some way to do the magic spell or so on that's required to complete the puzzle. So that's it. Let me know what you think of these ideas, if you plan on running them in your own campaign, or if you have other ways to make it more balanced and fun. I feel that all these can make really interesting and engaging scenarios that you can do competitively with other D&D groups. And as I said in the beginning, if you don't feel like having this be any competition, you can always make this a solely PvE situation, and I feel like it could be just as fun. Thanks so much for tuning in, and have fun gaming. Bye!